I learned something cruel about marriage on my 32nd birthday. The people who promise to protect your heart sometimes become the first to make a room laugh while it breaks. My name is Emma Carter, and if you had walked into the Moretti family's private celebration that night, you would have thought you were watching one of New York's most successful couples. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above polished marble floors. A string quartet played softly beside towering windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline, and waiters in white jackets floated through the ballroom, carrying silver trays filled with champagne. My husband, Ryan Carter, wore the perfect smile that had helped him build a reputation as the charming nephew of one of the city's most powerful businessmen. Standing beside him in my navy blue evening dress, I smiled too, because after 6 years of marriage I had become very good at pretending everything was fine. The truth was hidden beneath that smile, buried under months of criticism disguised as jokes, comments disguised as concern, and silence disguised as peace. Earlier that afternoon, I had stood in front of our bedroom mirror, turning sideways again and again, wondering if the dress really made me look larger or if I had simply started seeing myself through Ryan's eyes. I almost changed into something black, something loose, something that would disappear into the background. But then I remembered something my late mother used to tell me. Never apologize for taking up space. I held on to those words as long as I could. Halfway through dinner, Ryan stood to make a toast. Everyone lifted their glasses. His parents smiled proudly. His cousins leaned forward. Even the photographers hired for the event raised their cameras. Ryan wrapped one arm around my shoulder, and for one hopeful second I believed he was finally going to say something kind. Instead, he laughed. "Here's to my beautiful wife," he announced, pausing just long enough for everyone to expect something romantic. She was even more beautiful before she became best friends with dessert. Laughter exploded around the table. Some guests tried to hide it behind their glasses. Others didn't bother. My cheeks burned so hot I thought everyone could see the color rising beneath my skin. Ryan squeezed my shoulder as though he had delivered the greatest joke of the evening. "Don't look so serious," he added with another grin. "I'm only trying to motivate you." I forced a smile because crying would have given them another story to tell tomorrow. Across the endless dining table, however, one person never laughed. Vincent Moretti sat at the far end beneath the glow of a crystal chandelier, dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit with a silver watch catching the light as he slowly set his glass back onto the table. He was Ryan's uncle, a man whose name carried enough weight that conversations usually stopped when he entered a room. Newspapers called him ruthless. Business magazines called him untouchable. The city whispered about his influence in places no headlines ever mentioned. Yet in that moment, the only thing I noticed was the way his gray eyes rested on me instead of my husband. They weren't filled with pity. They weren't filled with amusement. They looked almost disappointed, but not in me. Ryan kept talking, unaware that every word seemed to make the room colder. "Maybe by next year's party," he joked, "she'll fit into the dress she wore when we got married." More laughter followed. I lowered my eyes to my untouched plate, wondering how many pieces of myself I had quietly surrendered just to keep this marriage alive. Then I heard the unmistakable sound of a chair sliding across polished marble. The laughter faded almost instantly. When Vincent Moretti stood up, the entire room fell silent without anyone asking them to. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't glare. He simply looked at Ryan for one long moment before turning his attention toward me. And somehow that single glance felt like the beginning of a story none of us were prepared to survive. No one questioned why Vincent Moretti stood. No one asked where he was going. Men like him never needed to explain themselves. He adjusted the cuff of his black jacket with slow precision, nodded politely toward the guests who instinctively stepped aside, and walked away from the table without a single word. Only after the heavy doors of the ballroom closed behind him did the conversations cautiously begin again, quieter than before. Ryan shrugged with an awkward laugh and lifted his champagne glass once more. "My uncle has always hated birthday speeches," he said, trying to recover the mood. A few people forced nervous smiles, but something had changed. The laughter no longer sounded confident. I excused myself before anyone could stop me and walked quickly through the long hallway leading toward the private elevators. Every crystal light reflected against polished marble, making the corridor feel impossibly bright while my chest felt unbearably heavy. I reached the ladies' lounge, closed the door behind me, and and stared at my reflection. Carefully applied makeup could hide dark circles beneath tired eyes, but it could not hide humiliation. I touched the side of my face, wondering when I had started believing every cruel joke Ryan made. 6 years earlier, he used to bring me coffee before work because he knew I skipped breakfast during busy mornings. He used to leave handwritten notes inside my planner reminding me to take breaks. Somewhere between promotions, family expectations, and endless charity dinners, those small acts of kindness disappeared. They were replaced by comments about calories, dresses, photographs, and how successful men deserved wives who looked perfect beside them. I had convinced myself that if I lost another 15 pounds, if I smiled more, if I stopped arguing, things would return to the way they once were. Instead, every compromise only seemed to move the finish line farther away. A quiet knock interrupted my thoughts. I quickly wiped the corner of one eye before opening the door. Rosa, the longtime house manager for the Moretti estate, offered me a gentle smile. She had worked for the family longer than anyone could remember and carried herself with the calm dignity of someone who had witnessed generations of triumphs and mistakes. "Miss Carter," she said softly, "Mr. Moretti asked me to check whether you were all right." I blinked in surprise. "He did." Rosa nodded. "He did not ask me to comfort you. He only said that no guest should ever feel abandoned in this house." Something tightened in my throat. Ryan had not come looking for me. My own husband was probably still entertaining guests, while the only person who had noticed my absence was the man everyone in New York described as cold. "Please tell him I am fine," I answered quietly. Rosa looked at me with kind but knowing eyes. Sometimes saying we are fine is simply another way of asking to be left alone. Before I could respond, she handed me a small ivory business card. There was no company logo, no decorative design, only one name embossed in silver lettering. Vincent Moretti. Beneath it was a private phone number. "He asked me to give you this only if you insisted you were fine," Rosa explained. Confusion spread across my face. "Why?" She smiled almost sadly. "Because he said people who say they are fine are usually carrying the heaviest burdens." My fingers closed around the card as if it weighed much more than paper. At that exact moment, the ballroom doors opened down the hallway, and Ryan's laughter echoed through the corridor before he appeared with 2 cousins beside him. He stopped when he saw me holding the card. His eyes narrowed for only a fraction of a second before the familiar, charming smile returned. "There you are," he called cheerfully. "Come on, everyone is waiting for birthday cake." His gaze briefly dropped to the card still resting in my hand. The smile remained on his face, but something uncertain flickered behind his eyes for the very first time that evening. Ryan slipped the ivory card from my fingers with an easy smile that looked harmless to everyone except me. He glanced at the silver letters, then chuckled before handing it back. "My uncle must be recruiting again," he said lightly. "Do not let him intimidate you. He treats business like a military operation." I forced a small smile and tucked the card into my evening clutch without answering. The rest of the celebration passed in a blur of speeches, photographs, and polite conversations I barely heard. Every few minutes, Ryan placed a hand around my waist whenever cameras appeared, performing the role of a devoted husband so naturally that even I almost believed it. When the final guests began leaving close to 11 o'clock, we rode home in silence through the glowing streets of Manhattan. Rain dotted the windows of the black sedan, while the city lights stretched into blurred ribbons of gold. Ryan scrolled through his phone without looking at me. Finally, he sighed. "You could have laughed tonight instead of making everything awkward." I turned toward him in disbelief. I was the one who made it awkward. He shrugged without lifting his eyes from the screen. "Emma, you take everything personally. It was a joke. People joke. Successful families tease each other. You always choose the most dramatic interpretation." I looked out the window again because I had heard those words too many times before. Dramatic, sensitive, emotional. They had slowly replaced the woman I used to recognize. There was a time when I walked confidently through corporate boardrooms wearing tailored suits and leading negotiations for executives twice my age. Before I married Ryan, I had built a reputation as one of the most dependable executive assistants at Sterling Financial Group. I loved impossible schedules, complicated travel plans, and solving problems before anyone else noticed they existed. My supervisors trusted me because I remembered every detail and never panicked under pressure. Ryan admired that confidence when we first met. He used to tell everyone that my intelligence was the first thing he noticed about me. Somewhere along the way, those compliments faded. After we married, he encouraged me to leave my demanding career, insisting that his growing consulting business needed someone to manage our home life instead. I believed him because I believed in us. Then, 2 years later, I became pregnant. We decorated a small bedroom in soft green, argued playfully about baby names, and imagined birthdays that never came. Losing that pregnancy changed something inside me that I could never fully explain. Grief settled quietly into my body. Sleepless nights became emotional eating. Doctor appointments replaced gym memberships. The scale climbed little by little, and with every pound I gained, Ryan's patience seemed to shrink. At first, he suggested healthier recipes. Then he bought me workout equipment for Christmas. Eventually, the suggestions became jokes, and the jokes became regular conversations. He never shouted. He never insulted me when we were alone. Instead, he smiled while saying things that left invisible bruises on my confidence. You have such a pretty face. You would look incredible if you just stayed disciplined. You should thank me for being honest because nobody else will be. I accepted each sentence as motivation instead of recognizing it as slow erosion. By the time our car stopped outside our townhouse in the Upper East Side, exhaustion had replaced anger. Ryan stepped out first, straightened his jacket, and casually said, "By the way, Uncle Vincent rarely notices anyone. If he gave you that card, he probably just needs another assistant. He goes through employees faster than anyone I know." He laughed at his own comment while unlocking the front door. I remained standing on the sidewalk for a moment with my hand resting inside my clutch, my fingers touching the edges of the business card. Somehow I did not believe Ryan. There had been nothing ordinary about the way Vincent Moretti looked at me across that dinner table, and for reasons I could not yet understand, that single silent glance refused to leave my mind. 3 mornings later, I stood outside Moretti Global Holdings with a paper coffee cup growing cold between my hands and Vincent Moretti's business card tucked inside my wallet. I had no appointment. I had no resume. I had no plan beyond proving to myself that I still remembered who Emma Carter had been before she started measuring her worth through someone else's opinions. The headquarters rose 50 stories above Midtown Manhattan, its glass walls reflecting the bright October sky like polished steel. Men and women in tailored suits crossed the lobby with quiet confidence, while the receptionist greeted each visitor by name. For a moment, I almost turned around. Ryan's voice echoed inside my head, reminding me that I was no longer competitive, no longer polished enough, no longer the woman executives trusted with impossible schedules. Then I remembered another voice, softer and steadier. Never apologize for taking up space. I approached the reception desk and placed the ivory card on the marble counter. The receptionist looked down, then immediately stood. Her expression changed from professional courtesy to unmistakable respect. "Good morning, Mrs. Carter. Mr. Moretti has been expecting you." My heartbeat stumbled. "Expecting me?" She smiled politely. "Please follow me." I followed her through a quiet hallway lined with contemporary artwork until we reached a private elevator requiring a security badge. The doors opened onto the top executive floor where silence replaced the noise of the city below. Everything felt deliberate, from the dark wood panels to the fresh white orchids placed beside floor to ceiling windows overlooking Central Park. She stopped outside a pair of walnut doors and gently knocked once before opening them. Vincent Moretti stood beside the windows with his hands behind his back, watching the skyline instead of the office entrance. He turned only after the door closed. "Mrs. Carter," he said calmly, "thank you for coming." His voice carried the same quiet authority I remembered from the dinner, yet there was nothing intimidating about the way he looked at me. There was no judgment, no curiosity about my appearance, no polite attempt to pretend the birthday celebration had never happened. He simply waited. "I almost did not," I admitted. "I know." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Most people need several days before deciding whether hope is worth the risk." I looked around his office. There were no oversized family portraits or displays celebrating awards. Instead, there were shelves filled with books, framed architectural sketches, and a single photograph of an older woman smiling beside a younger Vincent dressed far less formally than he was today. The room felt surprisingly personal for a man known throughout New York as distant and untouchable. "Why did you ask me here?" I finally asked. Vincent walked toward his desk and placed a slim folder in front of me. "Because I need an executive secretary." I blinked in surprise. Surely you have hundreds of qualified candidates. I dismissed 3 this year. He answered without embarrassment. Competence is common. Character is not. I hesitated before touching the folder. You barely know me. His gray eyes held mine without wavering. I know your employment history. I know every executive who supervised you recommended you without hesitation. I know your organizational skills doubled efficiency at Sterling Financial Group. I also know you left a successful career because you believed in your marriage. I stared at him in stunned silence. He had not investigated my private life to embarrass me. He had learned enough to recognize the woman I had forgotten. Vincent gently slid the folder closer. I am not offering you charity, Emma. I am offering you an opportunity to remember your own value. For the first time in years, someone had spoken to me as if my future mattered more than my past, and I realized I no longer wanted to spend the rest of my life becoming smaller just to make someone else feel bigger. For the next week, I lived 2 different lives. Every morning, I arrived at Moretti Global Holdings before 8 o'clock, reviewed schedules, organized meetings across 3 time zones, and anticipated problems before they reached Vincent Moretti's desk. Every evening, I returned to a townhouse, where Ryan barely looked up from his phone unless he wanted to criticize something I had done wrong. The contrast became impossible to ignore. At Moretti Global, people thanked one another for small efforts. Deadlines were demanding, but respect was never optional. Vincent expected excellence from everyone, including himself, yet he never raised his voice or humiliated anyone to make a point. If a mistake happened, he focused on solving it instead of assigning blame. More than once I caught myself waiting for a sarcastic remark that never came. Instead, I heard words I had almost forgotten existed. Good work, Emma. Excellent preparation. Thank you. Those simple sentences restored pieces of confidence I thought had disappeared forever. One Thursday afternoon, after a board meeting ended ahead of schedule, Vincent noticed me rubbing my temples while reviewing travel arrangements. For an upcoming conference in Chicago, he quietly placed a cup of hot tea beside my laptop. You skipped lunch, he observed. I looked up in surprise. How did you know? You solve everyone else's problems before remembering your own. There was no accusation in his voice, only quiet concern. I smiled for the first time that day. I used to be better at balancing everything. Vincent leaned lightly against the edge of the conference table. No, you simply stopped believing you deserve the same care you give other people. His words stayed with me long after he returned to his office. That evening, I arrived home nearly an hour later than usual because of unexpected flight changes for one of the executive teams. Ryan was already in the dining room scrolling through his tablet while untouched takeout containers sat on the kitchen counter. Without looking at me, he asked, "Still working for my uncle?" "Yes." "You seem happier lately." I nodded carefully. "I enjoy working again." He laughed without warmth. "Do not get carried away. You are answering emails, not running the company." I quietly placed my bag on a chair and began setting the table. Ryan looked up just long enough to study me. "By the way, there is a charity gala next Saturday. We're something flattering this time. Uncle Vincent will be there, and I would rather not have you embarrassing me." I froze with a dinner plate in my hands. A week earlier, I would have apologized. I would have promised to try harder. Instead, I calmly asked, "Embarrassing you by existing?" Ryan frowned, clearly surprised that I had answered back. "Do not twist my words. I am repeating the message." Silence settled between us. It was not loud or dramatic, but it felt different from every silence we had shared before. For the first time, I realized I no longer feared disappointing him as much as I feared losing myself again. Later that night, unable to sleep, I opened my laptop and reviewed old photographs stored in forgotten folders. There I was standing confidently beside executives after successful negotiations, laughing with coworkers over coffee, accepting an employee recognition award with genuine pride. I stared at the woman, smiling from those pictures, and finally understood something that changed everything. Vincent Moretti had not given me a new identity. He had simply reminded me that the strongest version of Emma Carter had existed long before Ryan convinced her she was not enough. And once that realization took root, pretending everything was fine became far more difficult than telling the truth. The charity gala arrived with the first sharp breeze of November, wrapping Manhattan in crisp air and streets sparkling beneath early holiday lights. I almost declined the invitation, but Vincent had made it clear that several international partners expected members of the executive team to attend. This time I was not standing beside Ryan as decoration. I was there because I had earned my place. I chose a simple emerald green gown that fit comfortably instead of trying to hide every curve of my body. As I looked into the mirror before leaving the townhouse, I noticed something surprising. I was not searching for flaws anymore. I was searching for confidence, and little by little, I could see it returning. Ryan barely glanced at me before adjusting his tie. "At least that dress is more flattering," he remarked as though he were offering a compliment. I simply picked up my coat without responding. During the drive downtown, the silence between us felt permanent instead of uncomfortable. At the hotel ballroom, hundreds of business leaders, investors, and nonprofit directors filled the elegant venue. Cameras flashed near the entrance while conversations drifted through the room like soft music. The moment Vincent arrived, the atmosphere subtly shifted. People greeted him with quiet respect rather than loud excitement. He acknowledged each person with measured courtesy before his eyes briefly found mine across the crowd. There was no lingering stare, no secret smile, only a slight nod that somehow steadied my nerves more than any speech could have. Throughout the evening, I coordinated schedule adjustments, introduced guests to the correct executives, and resolved 2 unexpected changes when a keynote speaker's flight was delayed. The work felt familiar, almost effortless, and for the first time in years, I completely forgot to worry about how I looked. Near the end of the reception, one of the board members approached Vincent while I organized briefing folders nearby. "You made an excellent decision hiring Emma," the older gentleman said openly. "She anticipated every issue before the rest of us even noticed them." Vincent answered without hesitation. "She has been capable from the beginning. She simply needed an environment where ability was recognized instead of questioned." He was not speaking to impress anyone. His voice carried the quiet certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. I lowered my eyes to the folders in my hands, suddenly overwhelmed by emotions I could not easily explain. A few minutes later, Ryan walked over holding 2 glasses of sparkling water. His smile remained perfectly polished until he noticed several executives thanking me for my work. "You seem very popular tonight," he said with forced humor after they left. "People appreciate competence," I replied calmly. He laughed, but it sounded strained. "Do not forget who introduced you to this family." Before I could answer, Vincent stepped beside us. "Actually," he said evenly, "Emma introduced herself tonight through her own professionalism." Ryan's expression stiffened for a fraction of a second before he forced another smile. "Of course, I was only joking." Vincent looked at him with the same composed expression I remembered from the birthday dinner. "Some jokes become habits. Habits reveal character." The words were delivered without anger, yet they settled over the conversation with unmistakable weight. Ryan quickly excused himself after spotting another guest across the ballroom. As he walked away, I released a breath I had not realized I was holding. Vincent turned toward me. "You handled yourself well this evening." I smiled softly. I remembered how. He nodded once. "No, Emma. You remembered who." As the orchestra began playing the final song of the night and guests slowly made their way toward the exits, I realized something else had quietly changed. I no longer looked at Vincent Moretti as an intimidating man whose approval mattered because of his power. I looked at him as someone who had seen my worth before I was able to see it again myself, and that realization felt far more dangerous than either of us was willing to admit. The Monday after the gala, New York woke beneath a gray winter sky, but inside Moretti Global Holdings the pace never slowed. By 8 o'clock, every conference room was booked, international calls were already underway, and my calendar was filled down to the minute. 3 months earlier, that schedule would have intimidated me. Now it reminded me that I was capable of handling far more than I had allowed myself to believe. As I finalized briefing materials for an executive strategy meeting, Vincent stepped into my office carrying a thin blue folder. "Before the board arrives, I need your opinion," he said. I looked up in surprise. "My opinion?" He placed the folder on my desk. "That is why I hired you." Inside were proposals from 3 consulting firms competing for a major expansion project in Chicago. I carefully reviewed each presentation, making notes as I worked. 20 minutes later, I looked back at Vincent. The lowest bid is also the weakest. The highest bid is impressive, but the timeline is unrealistic. The middle proposal has the strongest logistics plan, and they identified supply chain risks that the others ignored. Vincent nodded once, almost as though he had expected exactly that answer. That was my conclusion as well. He closed the folder without another question. Prepare the contract. After he left, I sat quietly for a moment. Ryan had spent years questioning every decision I made until I doubted my own judgment. Vincent had done the opposite. He trusted my professional instincts before I fully trusted them myself. Late that afternoon, I received a message from Ryan asking me to meet him for coffee near his office. Curious, I agreed. He was already seated when I arrived, wearing the same polished smile that had once charmed everyone around him. You have been busy, he said casually. People keep talking about you at family dinners. I stirred my coffee without answering. He leaned forward. You have made your point, Emma. You proved you can work again. Maybe it is time to come home. I looked at him carefully. I never stopped living at home. His smile faded slightly. You know what I mean. For a long moment, I searched his face, hoping to see regret, accountability, or even simple kindness. Instead, I saw irritation that life was no longer unfolding according to his expectations. Ryan, I said quietly, when was the last time you asked whether I was happy? He blinked as though the question had never occurred to him. Marriage is not about being happy every second. No, I agreed. But it should not require one person to disappear so the other can feel important. He looked away toward the crowded sidewalk outside the cafe. You are letting my uncle influence you. I shook my head gently. He did not tell me who to become. He reminded me who I already was. Ryan stood abruptly, frustration replacing his practiced composure. You are making a mistake. I remained seated. The mistake was believing I deserved less respect than I gave everyone else. He left without finishing his coffee. That evening, after returning to the office, I found a sealed envelope waiting on my desk. There was no name written on the front. Inside rested a single photograph taken years earlier at an employee recognition ceremony from my time at Sterling Financial Group. I was smiling broadly while accepting an award, completely unaware that someone had captured the moment. Tucked behind the photograph was a handwritten note in Vincent's unmistakably precise handwriting. It read, "Never allow anyone to convince you that the woman in this photograph disappeared. She has been waiting for you to find her again." I stared at those words until the office around me grew quiet, and for the first time I realized that what had begun as gratitude was slowly becoming something much deeper, something neither of us had planned, and something that would soon change every relationship inside the Moretti family forever. The quarterly leadership meeting was held the following Friday inside the historic Moretti estate, a tradition that brought together every senior executive, family shareholder, and trusted advisor under one roof. The mansion looked as elegant as ever, but beneath its polished appearance the atmosphere felt unusually tense. Conversations stopped whenever Ryan entered a room, only to begin again in quieter voices after he walked away. I noticed the change immediately, although I did not yet understand the reason. As Vincent's executive secretary, I spent the morning coordinating presentations, updating financial reports, and ensuring every guest had the correct briefing materials. It was the kind of work I genuinely enjoyed because every completed detail reminded me that I had rebuilt a career I once believed was gone forever. Shortly before the afternoon session began, Vincent asked me to remain in the conference room while everyone else took a short break. He closed the leather folder in front of him and looked toward the large windows overlooking the Hudson River before speaking. There is something you deserve to know before today's meeting continues. His voice remained calm, but there was unusual weight behind every word. Several weeks ago, our internal audit discovered irregularities involving one of our consulting divisions. I listened quietly without interrupting. The investigation is complete, he continued. The evidence shows that Ryan approved inflated invoices submitted by an outside consulting firm. The company paid far more than the services were worth. I stared at him in disbelief. Did he benefit from it? Vincent met my eyes. The investigators found financial records showing that he accepted undisclosed compensation through a third party. The board has already reviewed the findings. My thoughts raced. This was not a misunderstanding or a rumor. It was documented, verified, and impossible to dismiss as another family disagreement. Suddenly, so many moments from the past made painful sense. Ryan's expensive purchases that never matched his reported bonuses. His confidence that consequences never applied to him. his belief that charm could always replace accountability. Before I could respond, the conference room doors opened and the remaining board members returned to their seats. Ryan entered with the same polished smile he always wore at important meetings, greeting relatives and investors as though nothing in the world had changed. He even smiled at me with practiced ease before taking his place near the center of the table. The meeting began routinely with quarterly financial updates until Vincent calmly requested the audit committee's final report. A thick binder was placed before every board member. Silence gradually replaced casual conversation as pages turned one after another. Questions became fewer. Expressions became more serious. Finally, the committee chair spoke. The investigation unanimously concluded that company policy was violated through deliberate concealment of financial arrangements. No voices were raised. No dramatic accusations filled the room. The evidence spoke for itself. Ryan attempted to explain that the payments represented standard consulting incentives, but every answer was met with another document, another signed approval, another financial record that contradicted his explanation. The confidence that had defined him for years slowly disappeared. He looked around the table searching for support, yet no one interrupted the process. At last his eyes settled on me. There was disappointment in them, but not because I had caused his situation. For the first time, he seemed to realize that I was no longer the woman who would quietly absorb every consequence while protecting his image. When the committee finished its presentation, Vincent folded his hands and spoke with measured composure. Leadership is not sustained by reputation alone. It survives only through integrity. The room remained completely still. Ryan lowered his eyes without another argument. As the meeting adjourned, board members quietly filed out of the conference room, leaving behind an unmistakable truth. The empire Ryan believed would always protect him had chosen principles over family connections, and standing in that silent room, I understood that the hardest chapter of my marriage had finally reached its end, while an entirely different future had just begun. Spring arrived in New York almost unnoticed, replacing icy sidewalks with blooming trees along Park Avenue, and filling the city with the quiet promise that difficult seasons never lasted forever. 3 months had passed since the board meeting that changed everything. Ryan and I finalized our divorce with far less drama than I once feared because there was very little left to argue about. Somewhere along the way, I had stopped trying to convince him to see my worth. That was never my responsibility to begin with. I moved into a bright apartment overlooking the East River, returned to morning walks before work, and slowly rebuilt a life that belonged entirely to me. The number on the scale no longer determined whether I deserved kindness. Some days I exercised. Some days I simply enjoyed breakfast without guilt. The greatest transformation had nothing to do with my appearance. It was the quiet confidence that returned every time I looked in the mirror and recognized myself again. At Moretti Global Holdings, life settled into a comfortable rhythm. Projects expanded, new partnerships flourished, and I found genuine satisfaction in solving challenges that once seemed impossible. Vincent never treated me differently because of what we had both survived. He continued expecting excellence, continued thanking people for honest work, and continued leading with the quiet integrity that had earned everyone's respect long before I entered his office carrying a worn business card. One Friday evening, he asked whether I had time for one last meeting before the weekend. Expecting another project briefing, I followed him onto the rooftop garden above headquarters where the Manhattan skyline glowed beneath the setting sun. Fresh tulips lined the stone pathways, and the breeze carried the distant sounds of the city below. Vincent rested his hands lightly against the railing before turning toward me. "There is something I have wanted to tell you for a very long time," he said. I smiled gently. "I am listening." He took a slow breath. "When I watched you at that birthday dinner, I recognized someone trying very hard to disappear because another person had convinced her she deserved less than respect. I could not change what happened that night. I could only offer you a door." My eyes filled with quiet emotion. "You gave me much more than a door." He shook his head with a small smile. "No, Emma. You walked through it yourself." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence felt peaceful rather than uncertain. Then Vincent reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small velvet box. He opened it slowly, revealing a simple diamond ring that reflected the golden light of the evening sky. "I am not asking because you need someone to rescue you," he said softly. "I am asking because I have come to admire your strength, your kindness, your courage, and the life you have rebuilt with your own hands. If you choose to spend the future with me, I will spend every day making certain you never question your value again." Tears blurred the skyline as I looked at the man who had never asked me to become smaller, prettier, quieter, or easier to love. He had simply believed in me until I learned to believe in myself. I smiled through those tears and answered with complete certainty, "Yes." Months later, during a quiet family gathering filled with laughter instead of judgment, Rosa hugged me warmly before whispering, "Your mother would be proud." I looked across the room where Vincent was laughing with relatives, and for the first time in many years I understood what home truly felt like. It was never about perfection, appearances, or earning someone else's approval. Home was the place where respect came before expectation, where kindness carried more weight than criticism, and where love never required you to become less than the person you were always meant to be.